Harper Paperbacks and Harper Monahan are proud to present How to Read the Constitution and Why by Kim Wehle. This is an Iliotibial Band Sleeps reading. Chapter 12, Sustaining Democracy, Some Takeaways. Article 5. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. There is nothing in the Constitution on what this process would look like. In April 2017, after his first 100 days in office, Donald J. Trump considered the milestone in an interview with Fox News. He'd had a rough few months, although he managed to get Neil Gorsuch confirmed to the Supreme Court. His immigration travel ban had been struck down, his effort to secure formal repeal of Obamacare had failed, and his approval rating was abysmal 40 to 42%. For Trump, part of the blame was the Constitution itself. It's a very rough system, he explained. It's a very archaic system. It's really bad for the country. Trump's disdain for the Constitution is not just theoretical. He believes how the Constitution works is fundamentally flawed, that no due process protections should attach to his zero-tolerance policy on immigration, for example. When somebody comes in, he wrote on Twitter, "We must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. Regular people have polarized views on immigration, to be sure, but unraveling any constitutional protection is a dangerous business." Perhaps most compelling is Trump's repeated insistence that the Constitution does not limit his power as president. To him, the appointment of Robert Mueller to investigate Russian interference with the 2016 presidential election is totally unconstitutional. Trump also takes the position that it's legally impossible for him to obstruct justice, and that he has an absolute right to pardon himself of criminal wrongdoing. That the Trump presidency has eroded parts of the Constitution isn't entirely Trump's fault. For his first 2 years in office, there was no cop on the block willing to police him. Republicans in Congress won't do it, but if the Constitution is allowed to lapse today, it will lose its authority as a set of rules to be followed tomorrow. For people in power, no accountability means no more power for the taking. A new constitutional convention. The question for America today, therefore, is whether this is a constitution worth keeping. History shows that there are many insidious ways that it can be thwarted if those in power get too much power. During the Reconstruction era, following the Civil War, for example, white Southerners felt threatened by the enfranchisement of former slaves. The electorally dominant white male Democrats changed the rules. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states reformed their constitutions and electoral laws to disenfranchise African Americans through poll taxes, property requirements, literacy tests, and complex written ballots. Of course, most formerly enslaved people could not read or write. Georgia Senator Robert Toombs declared at the time, "Give us a convention and I will fix it so that the Negro shall never be heard from." As I mentioned already, the 24th Amendment passed in 1964 deemed poll taxes unconstitutional and made voting a right for all men and women over the age of 21. 7 years later, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Today, people across the nation are calling for another constitutional convention to fundamentally change the text of the Constitution itself. This little-known fact is extraordinary. Think about it. The last time a convention happened was in 1787, and it produced the very document that we've spent the last upteenth pages talking about. The prospect of another one is real. At the annual convention of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, in August 2018, former Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn guessed that we're 3 or 4 years away. ALEC is an organization that links powerful lobbyists with lawmakers, so it's a force to be taken seriously. Coburn is also a senator advisor to an organization called the Convention of States, which is one of several groups working to get 2/3 of state legislatures to request a constitutional convention, and under Article 5 of the Constitution, Congress shall convene a meeting under those circumstances. To be sure, as we've seen, the Constitution is not self-executing. Congress might figure out ways around such a request, but to do so would be politically risky if the states are demanding it, and there's no telling what the outcome would be. For people like Coburn, a convention looks like the only answer for a failing republic that's going to become a socialist, Marxist country like Western Europe. As far as me and my family and my guns, he explained, I'm going to be free. To date, 28 of the required 34 state legislatures have active bills calling for a convention. 2, Arizona and Wyoming, came on board since Trump was elected. 3 others, Maryland, Nevada, and New Mexico, recently repealed laws that had previously called for a convention to consider a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. In 7 more states, the legislatures are completely controlled by Republicans: Idaho, Kentucky, Minnesota, Montana, South Carolina, Virginia, and Wisconsin. If those states seek a convention as well, particularly around a unified issue, which would give Congress less wiggle room to find a convention not mandatory, then we as a country would be in a full-scale constitutional meltdown. Although Article 5 refers to states calling a convention for proposing amendments, there would be nothing to stop a convention from becoming an effort to scrap the Constitution altogether and start all over again. After all, this is precisely what happened in 1787 with the Articles of Confederation. What began as an amendment process turned into a wholesale rewriting of the rules governing those in power in the United States. If that were to happen again, there's no telling what kind of government we'd end up with. It's not hard to imagine an amendment to dictate that life begins at conception, or stating that immigrants are not protected by the Constitution at all, or making clear that the Due Process Clause does not create any substantive right. A provision that would open the door for government restrictions on population growth, child rearing, the ability to travel from state to state without government interference, and personal medical choices other than abortion. Current backers of the convention idea want to repeal the federal income tax. Without money, of course, the federal government would shut down and cease to exist. It boggles the mind to contemplate how broadly this country's entrenched divisions would widen in that event. The Convention of States reportedly already has 2.5 million supporters ready to mobilize, twice that of the NRA, along with high-profile people like Sarah Palin, Sean Hannity, Bobby Jindal, and Rand Paul, who favor a constitutional convention. Other conservatives are against the idea because a constitution could rewrite our constitution and destroy its protection of our rights. Liberals are also mixed, with some supporting of a convention to overturn the Supreme Court's greenlighting of corporate money into politics in the Citizens United decisions. To be sure, for a new constitution to be ratified, it would have to meet the existing documents requirement that 3/4 of the states agree. But in today's political climate, anything could happen. The Articles of Confederation itself required that the states unanimously consent to any changes. The framers of the Constitution simply ignored this, deciding that ratification by 9 of the 13th original states was just fine. Moreover, there's no telling what the procedural rulings and voting requirements of the convention might be. There is absolutely no force that can override what the convention does, explained Professor David Super at Georgetown Law School. Congress can send them rules, state legislators can send them rules, but they can do what they want. I'm not sure there'd even be one vote for blocking it on the Supreme Court. The precedent is that strong. Even Justice Scalia, a groundbreaker in the world of conservative constitutional thinking, believed that a new constitutional convention is a dangerous idea. In an April 2014 panel discussion with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, he was asked about amending the Constitution and replied, "I certainly would not want a constitutional convention. I mean, whoa, who knows what would come out of that?" And in a speech he made to the Conservative Federalist Society in 2015, he said, "A constitutional convention is a horrible idea. This is not a good century to write a constitution." Keep in mind that there are 2 pathways to a constitutional amendment: through Congress or through state-initiated process. To date, 33 amendments have been proposed, and all came from Congress. The reason for allowing states to trigger the process is a familiar one: checks and balances. If Congress were to amass too much power, the dual pathway theory goes, the states could step in and pull back. The fact that we haven't seen an amendment come out of the states in the history of our nation, despite hundreds of attempts, only underscores that we should legitimately fear the unknown here. The earliest time that a pro-convention activist could nab the 7 additional states needed for a convention is 2020, when Montana's legislature is next in session. Observers on both sides of the political spectrum consider a constitutional convention a viable possibility at that point. As of 2017, Republicans control the entire legislatures in 33 of the 50 states, so momentum for a conservative-backed convention exists today like never before. We owe the people must be our own constitutional cop. The question thus becomes, what can regular people do about this looming problem of the possible breakdown of our otherwise functioning constitutional system of government? How can we save our democracy from falling apart internally, let alone forestall a wholesale rewrite of the document itself? Some foundations. Having a cop on the block matters. The Constitution means something only if it's enforced. There's a big difference between policy and politics. Politics is about ideology. Policy is about using data and facts to reach a conclusion or argue for or against a particular outcome. Be careful not to confuse the two. Once a precedent is in the government's toolbox, it can be picked up for use at any time by any partisan. When government actors push existing boundaries, they expand their power, usually for keeps. Strict reading of the Constitution is a myth. There is no way to apply the Constitution without interpreting it, period. American values are not in the Constitution, but soft norms are critical to preserving individual liberties and ensuring an accountable government. No constitution power is absolute. The Constitution should be viewed through a lens of accountability for all government actors, full stop. With law, it all depends. Constitutional questions are squishy, not black and white. In answering the what will we do now question, we might want to supplement this list with a few additional concepts. One might be that whether we happen to align ourselves individually with the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, or something else, we should all recognize that democracy is safer in a multi-party system. If people who push for more power get pushback from opponents, that power is necessarily contained, and containment of government power is necessary in order to avoid an autocracy. 1 plus 0 equals, well, 1. Another concept might be that establishing fair procedures and enforcing those procedures matters in a functioning democracy. As we've seen with the breakdown of bipartisanship in Congress, if the team that's in the lead gets to change the rules in its favor halfway through the game, the integrity of the game itself suffers, and there's no buy-in from the fans of the losing team. People will get angry and seek like-minded people. If those people are in fact Russian bots, everyone ends up scammed. Democracy loses. In thinking about fair procedures, let's also not forget about those soft norms like honesty, truthfulness, decency, mutual respect, the many things in everyday existence that gives rise to meaningful, fruitful relationships and honorable lives. These things matter in government too. As for what to do in our crumbling democracy, it's hard to ignore the bottom line. Vote. Oh, and one more thing. Vote. More people watch the Super Bowl than vote in presidential elections. That is due to many factors, including systemic disenfranchisement and the self-defeating belief that my vote doesn't matter anyway. As an educator, I also happen to think that this belief has to do with the dearth of constitutional literacy. People don't really understand the system, so they can't grasp what's at stake and prioritize accordingly. In addition, there's a ton of misinformation out there, including what amounts to manipulative lies designed to make people take positions that benefit the powerful, not themselves. Navigating through this quagmire can feel overwhelming, if not hopeless. A preliminary step for voters is figuring out how to wade through information and identify what's worth believing and what is bunk. On this subject, soft norms come in handy. We know when we eat at a restaurant that they serve dog food or have rats in the kitchen. The health inspector will slap the operation with a fine or even close it down. For other vendors, it's their reputation that matters. We might choose a kitchen renovator based on referrals. We think about who we know that can be trusted to give us a straight scoop about whether a contractor is honest, reliable, fair, and does good work. The notion is that if the contractor gets enough horrible reviews on Yelp, he'll go out of business. His reputation is his livelihood, so he takes care to protect it. These days, some news outlets get away with lies and their reputations aren't affected. By the same token, traditionally trusted news sources are being hammered by the White House, so there's steady distrust of the media across the board. This is a bit of a scam, folks. The media is actually an important means of protecting the public from a corrupt government. As the saying goes, sunshine is the best disinfectant. Prior to the internet age, there was only a handful of news outlets, and they developed and adhered to a set of norms to ensure accurate and honest journalism. These included basic things like accuracy, double-checking sources, and objectivity, giving both sides of an issue. Despite the barrage of fake news today, some media outlets still try hard to abide by these norms. They self-police because their reputation matters to them. They are the ones that are worth reading, and they span the political spectrum. To find them, hop in a time machine and go back to, say, 1980. What did people read then? What did they watch? Sources like the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS all come to mind. You get the point. The other means of maximizing the quality of information you take in is to read original source documents. By this I mean that if a newspaper article discusses an indictment of a public figure, for example, it pays to read the actual indictment rather than just rely on the reporters to tell you what it says. Back in the day, original documents meant going to a courthouse and pulling a case file or traveling to a public library and tediously rolling through microfiche. It was a total pain. The nice thing about the internet is that all this stuff is now at your fingertips, a click of a mouse or a tap of a smartphone away, so to speak. Identifying websites or Twitter handles that will post original sources for you is also a nice feature of technology today. Don't trust what others tell you, read the thing for yourself. In short, choosing whom to vote for is issue-based, and figuring out what to believe on a particular issue requires a new 21st century skill, mining the internet for good information. In recent years, we've learned something else about voting that wasn't a thing, say, 30 years ago, and that is we can't assume that everyone will follow norms of decency and decorum if elected to office. So in choosing candidates, it's important to pick people whose values appear to align with our own and with those of the current Constitution. We the people and the government accountability. A final note on the favorite soft norm of mine, government accountability. Although the word accountability isn't in the Constitution itself, it's pretty hard to refute that our own structure of government is premised on the accountability for all who hold power. Nobody is above the law. Under the Constitution, the people are the sole source of governing power. Elected and appointing officials are not entitled to it. Every exercise of their power flows through, not from, the Constitution, and every person exercising that power remains ultimately and exclusively accountable to the people. Having fled a tyrannical monarchy, the founders of this country understandably wanted a government that is not only granted its people more freedoms but also responded to them. The Declaration of Independence thus provides that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It adds that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. In Federalist Number 49, Alexander Hamilton likewise stated that the people should be consulted whenever the structure of the government is altered, as the people are the only legitimate fountain of power. The framers' decision to opt for a republic instead of a direct democracy does not mean that the white male aristocracy, who were assumed to ascend from the upper echelons of the federal government, would somehow become many kings, however. Instead, it's the Constitution's opening salvo that we the people of the United States do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, emphasis mine. The Supreme Court has also repeatedly reinforced the notion that the government exercises only delegated powers that are channeled from the people through the Constitution. To hold otherwise is to overthrow the basis of our constitutional law. The founders' idea that power flows from the people is necessarily linked to the understanding that those who exercise power in the people's name must be accountable to them. As we've seen, the Constitution's very structure reflects a number of safeguards that foster accountability. Among other things, the framers established the federal government as one of limited and enumerated powers. Before the government can act, it must be able to trace its authority for its actions directly back to some provision of the Constitution, which was ordained and established by the people. So in order for there to be accountability under the Constitution, the source of federal power, the people must have some say in how it's exercised. Now one might respond to my little speech with the retort that even if the people choose to have a single-party government, indeed, even an autocracy, then so be it. If the government's power traces back to the people, and the people want a king, then we the people can have a king, right? Well, wrong. The Constitution assumes that the populace is safer if government adheres to the principles of constitutional structure, even if it's cumbersome to do so, and even occasional lapses seem innocuous. We're back to the cop on the block phenomenon. It's hard to reasonably debate that self-interest and corruption in government aren't destabilizing. Autocracy might mean that the lesser of two evils in some circumstances. Think Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, or Iraq after the defeat of Saddam Hussein. Many people in both countries have pined for the good old days when their lives were easier under a dictatorship. democracy is messy, consensus is messy, compromise is messy, which is all to say that our Constitution has served us pretty well. It has stood the test of 230 years' time, and is worth preserving, don't you think? And that was Chapter 12 of How to Read the Constitution and Why by Kim Wehle. I think this was a good demonstration that maybe I'm not as illiterate as I thought. On the topic of this being my first and hopefully last audiobook I record and publish to YouTube, I want to say thank you for listening. If I do this again, something has gone terribly wrong. There is talk of me reading the acknowledgments, the glossary, the Constitution of the United States of America, the notes, and the index. However, I will be reading none of those things, as it adds another 1/4 to the length of this book. And screw that. I'd like to thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like and subscribe. Subscribe to become a super subscriber. Share this video with anyone you think may enjoy it. And I'll never see you, but I hope you'll see me in the next video. Goodbye.